Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you may be listening to us from here on this beautiful planet we call Earth. This is Michael Cross here with another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions, where we like to dig a little bit deeper, question a little bit more, investigate things that, the mainstream media tends to kind of ignore, which is a lot in today's world. Now, tonight we have a very special guest. His name is Professor Richard Sugg from Durham University in the United Kingdom. And I ran across an article about one of his books called Mummies, Cannibals, and Vampires. Very fitting for this time of year. What got you writing about this sort of thing there, Richard?
Hi, thanks for talking. Good question. I think I like to talk about things that don't get talked about enough, or that get talked about mistakenly, if you like. So corpse medicine, which you just referred to, that's Mummies, Cannibals, and Vampires, is something that there's a lot of data about the fact that Europeans used human bodies for medicine. Pretty much everything you can think of was used by people which included Charles II, for example, and Robert Boyle, the scientist. And this was going on in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, and started, or was at its height roughly, just as the Europeans were violently denouncing the newly discovered American Indians, as they were then called, for cannibalism. Often cannibalism didn't exist, but sometimes genuine cannibalism that they tended to misunderstand the significance of. And the data was there on this, but you found that either it wasn't discussed or it was discussed in a very erroneous way that tended to whitewash the real facts. So I was keen to bring all this to light and to take off the whitewash and to restore, if you like, some dirty history. A more recent bit of work, which is partly a question of something that's talked about a lot but doesn't get talked about with all the facts actually there, is the other kind of vampires. The first vampires in that book were people who drank blood at execution scaffolds for medical reasons. But the vampires that people endlessly fascinated with in film, fiction, and so on nowadays, and which have been reduced to a kind of bit of fun for Halloween for, 5-year-old kids, or whatever it might be. These were things of amazing terror, of terror unto death, literally, as we'll explore in a few moments. So this was something that people thought they knew about, but actually was very, very different from our modern versions. And finally, I came across these other subjects. Researching the vampires was the Poltergeist, and from there actually ghosts as well. And this was something I got no interest in or no belief in for most of my life, but I was ambushed, as it were, by poltergeists when I was trying to track down vampires. And I've been researching this for a few years now, and I'm continually amazed by what I find. And I find one thing is that people experience this but feel embarrassed to talk about it. So it's stuff that doesn't get talked about, I think, in this area that I find very, very interesting. It's kind of hiding in plain sight, if you like.
Okay, so are you saying that okay, first of all, you're saying that people used to consume human body parts for some sort of medicinal purposes. And that's yeah?
Yes, that's right.
But of course, that's separate from the vampire folklore that was very common, throughout the world, but, in Europe, there was quite a bit of rich folklore about this.
Yes. I mean, I'd like to talk about the vampires that people know more commonly now, but you're quite right that human body parts and blood were consumed for at least 300 years all across Europe, and for longer amongst the poor, the uneducated. A little ironic detail which links the two areas, if you like, is that actually vampires claim to drink people's blood. People who are terrified unto death of vampires often said, no, I never heard of a vampire drinking blood, I never heard of that. But they were absolutely terrified of them. On the other hand, as Paul Barber, who's a great vampire expert, put it, though we don't hear much about vampires drinking people's blood, we know for sure that people drank vampires' blood. And this is true. People, for a cure, if they believe they were haunted by a vampire or attacked by a vampire, would take up the supposedly suspect body, open it up, do various things to it, but amongst others, if they could get any blood, or they thought was blood out of it, perhaps from the heart, they would drink this in water as a cure.
So the belief or the folklore was more that the vampire might be psychically draining your energy from the grave. That they weren't like the Nosferatu coming to your door and then coming in and attacking you.
It depends where you were. The first point you've made is an interesting one, because that belief was a powerful one in New England, in America. It's something I think people didn't know much about until a terrific book a few years ago called Food for the Dead by Michael Bell, who is a great labour of love going through all these old cases in which the vampire of New England in the 18th century, the 19th century, very late 19th century, was a scapegoat, basically, for sickness, particularly for consumption, which was a huge killer. And people got sick. In some cases, up to 13 people in the same family died one after another. And in this awful state of feeling powerless and helpless, people used the vampire as a scapegoat. And in that case, they didn't quite believe it's psychically draining you, but they believed that it could feed on you from its grave. It didn't have to leave its grave. And the evidence they needed was not the sense that it had come to your room at night and attacked you. It was a body with any kind of blood, anything resembling blood, resembling life, really, in it. So if the heart wasn't properly decayed, if it seemed to have fluid in it, and so forth. They really believed that this inert body, still in the grave, was feeding on the living, was sucking their life out. And you could see at the time how the belief would give them some kind of power, agency, sense of fighting back. So that's the New England belief. It's very interesting. I recommend Food for the Dead on that topic. But actually, on the whole, in much of Europe, Russia, Greece, there was a huge vampire area, and Central and Eastern Europe, people were terrified of vampires for actually quite a good reason, and that was because they really did seem to be coming into your room, to your bed, and singling you out in the dead of night. Now, this is because, substantially, not entirely, but of a medical phenomenon which will happen to all of us tonight. Fortunately, we'll get the fairly benign version of this. So the benign version is simply sleep paralysis, and this is useful. Sleep paralysis means that when you're dreaming asleep, you're paralyzed, and you're paralyzed, we assume, so that you can't act out your dreams, maybe bang your head on the furniture, make a lot of noise, and in past times attract a big tiger or a predator or indeed a cannibal to where you're sleeping. So this has a useful basic function. Normally we don't know anything about this. We're asleep, it happens, and it's all over. And I'd never come across it until I started doing this research. But what happens when you get sleep paralysis as a problem is that you essentially seem to wake up. Now, you can't move, you can't speak, you make maybe the most minimal sounds, and if you get sleep paralysis combined with a nightmare, and this is a very special type of nightmare, very capital N, what happens then is that you have an indescribable sense of dread. And people who describe themselves as straight, ferocious, lifelong materialists, atheists, and so on, say that it wasn't as though it was trying to get at my life, it was as though it was trying to get at my soul. The things getting at them vary, but they involve a figure, it approaches, it makes noises, it might make murmuring speech that's not quite decipherable. It comes closer, it gets onto the bed, it has a weight, so it's not like some kind of airy ghost. And mar from nightmare means to bruise or crush. So this sense of weight on your chest is very powerful, very heavy, you can't breathe. The experience seems to go on for a very long time, in fact probably much longer than it actually does if you clocked it. And fascinatingly, this experience is in a sense a little bit less scary if you can make some sense of it. So your mind in this traumatized state, half awake, half asleep, paralyzed, speechless, makes sense of it according to its local demons. So if you want a great trio of local demons to put in a boxing ring and fight it out, you could probably hardly do better than the witch, the vampire, and the alien abductor. And these are three big culprits in different cultures. I mean, guess that the last one's mainly North America, across the centuries. And certainly the witch and the vampire have scared people to death.
Okay, so you're saying it's like a psychological thing. If you subconsciously have these images of what a vampire or a witch would do, and I guess nowadays, little gray aliens with big eyes, then when you have this kind of, I forget what they call it. I don't think it's beta sleep, but kind of like you're awake during the whole rapid eye movement period of sleep, alpha state, something like. Anyway, then you're essentially having a waking nightmare.
Yes, you feel very much awake. People in modern accounts, there's lots of them on the internet now, people in modern accounts describe seeing their room exactly as it looks. They describe seeing a digital clock, clocking its minutes along, and so forth. And, yeah, everything seems very real, and that includes the figure coming at them, stifling them, sucking the life out of them, whatever it might be. And sometimes the terror, the physiological terror, the psychosomatic force of all this has been so strong in vampire cases and in other ones that people wake up with bruises on themselves, with scratches, with what you can easily see would be construed as bite marks in vampire culture, and they were.
Okay, so where did the whole idea of, our modern day vampire? Well, first of all, were there people, before we get into the modern day vampire, were there people like witches we know got accused of witchcraft and they were executed in mass throughout the ages in Europe? Were people actually convicted of being vampires? Living beings, or was this mostly just corpses that were draining energy?
That's an interesting question. There were a couple of British soldiers in Bulgaria in the 19th century, spent quite a long time there and got a lot of facts and stories and beliefs that you wouldn't easily find buried away near Varna out there. And one of the things they said was that their servant, Theodore, had inherited vampirism. He was alive, he was a young man, and something about his family meant that he'd inherited vampirism, and this was very serious for Theodore, who couldn't marry anybody or couldn't marry who he wanted because he would then produce vampire children. So yeah, you do get a few live vampires. Unfortunately, apart from Theodore, whose case is a bit mysterious, a lot of the time, basic rule in magical cultures, witches, vampires, whatever it might be, it's not a good idea to stand out. It's not a good idea to look different or to seem different. So Bulgaria, to give you a kind of vivid example of how much they could fear a living vampire, a man supposedly comes to the village and he's a stranger, as it were, so a foreigner, that's immediately a little bit suspect. He marries a local woman. Everything seems fine for a while, but the woman says that he goes away every Saturday night. This is often a vampire sign that makes people suspicious. And the villagers get hold of him, examine him. They say he's only got one nostril. Now, this is a medical condition, rare but known, that you don't have cartilage in the center of your nose. And the fact that he's only got one nostril clinches it. Grab him, tie him up, drag him out of the village, burn him alive. This happened sometime around the 1830s in the Bulgarian area where these soldiers were staying. So, yeah, to be a living vampire, to look odd, to be mentally ill, actually, in Russia, was to invite murder, basically, destruction, or, unofficial most of the time. But on the whole, vampires were dead bodies, were dead people. They were scapegoats in Europe just as they were in North America for disease, death, crop failure, bad weather, frost, surprising number of things. In the same way that witches were scapegoats for so many things, that anything that went wrong almost, you would blame a witch. And some of the reasons why a vampire came to be, apart from a lot of sudden death, a lot of sickness, bad weather, are surprisingly arbitrary and unfair. So suicide, this is a suspect kind of death, sudden death of any kind, accident, murder, whatever it might be, struck by lightning. Seems rather unlucky that you suffer this death and then you're, picked on after death and very possibly mutilated and so on. You're conceived on the wrong day. Numerous religious festivals, especially in Greece, mark you out for a vampire. You're born with a caul. Again, you look a bit different. But some of the most interesting reasons concern beliefs about the body and soul. And I can give an example here from Greece, which was recorded in the 1970s in a place called Evia, an island not that far from Athens. In the 1970s, a folklorist was there interviewing locals, and all the older villagers remembered this. It was that somebody died around about 1910, we're guessing from their age and so forth. It was the 20th century. A body, when it was waked, as it were, had to be watched the whole time. It was all done at home. It was very, very communal. Everybody was there, as many people as possible, children as well. So the irony was that you mustn't leave the corpse for a moment. It must be watched for every second before it was buried, because it was vulnerable to vampirism at this time. But because there were so many people around and they were awake all night, they were tired, they lost track of what they were supposed to be doing, they would sometimes commit what we might call a grave error, and this was that if you passed anything over the corpse at all, anything whatsoever, a cup of coffee, a child, whatever it might be, the corpse was instantly and irredeemably vampirized, and to such an extent that its soul was considered to be destroyed, or you had to destroy its soul to undo the harm. So this is a great heresy among pious Christians in maybe 1910, 1920 in Greece. And this happened, and the solution to this I'll come to when we get to how to destroy a vampire, because some very homely methods if listeners are concerned about how to destroy a vampire without a lot of high-tech equipment or a great lot of firewood. There are some homely ways to do it. The other main thing across a lot of cultures that caused a vampire to happen, or how to make a vampire, you might say, was very basic beliefs about life and death. To us, on the whole, you're either alive or you're dead. For most people, in most of history, you could be alive, you could be dead, or you could be slightly dead. And this has been a powerful belief about life and death since the time of the New Testament. So in various stages, but a crucial stage after sort of the person stops talking, stops walking, seems not to be conscious. A crucial stage is 3 days. But they're only slightly dead for those first 3 days, and the body is likely to be in the house in traditional cultures before it's buried. And this is very well illustrated in the Bible by the example of Lazarus, that you could argue the biggest miracle in the Bible, bigger than the raising of Christ himself, is the raising of Lazarus. And this was acknowledged by Martha when Christ proposes that he's going to raise Lazarus. Martha says, "But Lord, he has been dead 4 days and he stinks." So he's been dead too long. He's not just dead, but he's very dead. He's not slightly dead anymore. And the fact that he stinks implies the 3-day kind of window is based on decay, and obvious decay, olfactory decay. A body looks like it's really not going to come back to life again. So there's Lazarus, and all across vampire culture for hundreds of years afterwards, this was a powerful belief, and it also centered on the problem of the soul leaving the body. This wasn't a kind of automatic, absolute, if you like, flicking a switch, dead soul, bang, in heaven or in hell. This was a process that was difficult. So they broke a hole in the roof, they opened the windows, they opened the doors. In all sorts of cultures beyond vampire ones, they did this for a long time. With the concern that the soul had to get out, they covered liquid so it didn't fall into them and drown, and they believed it was hanging around, maybe on the door lintel, for a few days after it died. They put out food and drink for it. And in these cultures, they would actually sometimes take the corpse out of a special opening in the wall of the house, take it to the church, cemetery, and then on the basis that it would try and come back again and haunt the house as a vampire, they would brick up this hole, which has come to be known as a corpse door. This was quite a lot of trouble to do. You can still see examples of these bricked up doors or windows. And in one case, in Pench in Germany, a vampire named Kuntius, in probably the late 16th century, was originally buried in the church. And Kuntius caused such terror as a vampire for, I think it was months on end, that they actually broke a hole in the church to get him out and to destroy him adequately and very thoroughly. So, yeah, the soul was something. It was definite. Its exit from the body and to heaven or to hell was a process, and a difficult process. Perhaps the nicest example in this rather grisly literature is the Ukrainians, who believed that if you baked a special kind of bread after the death, the soul would rise to heaven on the steam.
Yeah, this reminds me a lot of the. I was in Tibet a few years ago.
Yeah.
And I was at a temple where they were conducting a sky burial. And they had brought in 5 bodies from the countryside, and they were doing all the chanting and everything before taking the bodies out to the hillside and feeding them to the vultures. And
yes.
We were talking to one of the monks, and he mentioned that that they believe that you leave the body in the house or wherever they're living, their dwelling, for 3 days.
Yeah.
And then at that point the soul's gone, and then in this case, most of them, they just put them on the back of like a motorbike and drive them to the temple. So this 3-day thing seems to extend even further than Europe.
That's right. I've never heard of that. It's very interesting. But I'd heard a case in Fiji where cannibals, for example, aggressive cannibals, believed that if you could get your enemy's body in the 3 days after it died, you could take their spirit, you could take their power. But it was a spiritual power. It was something like the soul in that case. So it's very, very widespread. And I guess it, to some extent, is based on the appearance of decay, which doesn't immediately start in a lot of cases.
Okay, before we get into Poltergeist, because I know you want to talk about that, how do figures such as Vlad the Impaler and Countess Bathory, and how do they factor into our modern idea of vampirism?
I suppose they give us a focus, if you like. They give us, big names. I don't think they're always that helpful because they tend to reduce a lot of very interesting, more anonymous data into these famous people. And I think the rich and the powerful have done enough harm across history without kind of hogging history falsely as well. As you might know, Bathory, and many people probably know, was reputed to be the biggest serial killer in history. Not just the biggest female one, but the biggest one per se. I mean, reports are hard to verify, but it's supposed to have killed perhaps more than 600 people. Her castle in Hungary before she was stopped and arrested. Vlad the Impaler, it's almost as though someone that mythically cruel kind of distills themselves into a vampire by the sheer force of what was actually real, awful cruelty, not supernatural cruelty, although it's so bad it could seem that way. So these figures, I think, give a name to hang things onto, but they're actually not as interesting as the more anonymous stuff that really goes on. The destruction of a vampire, for example, gives you stories sometimes with names, with dates, and so forth, with a lot of case histories. But these are ordinary people, and I think what ordinary people believed and did has got talked about too little again. So, yeah, I mean, listeners who are keen to destroy a vampire, your basic rule is you don't play nice with vampires. If you have to, you're very, very thorough. You might chop the body up into many pieces and then burn it to ashes. while the fire is burning, you drive back into the fire any animals, lizards, insects, birds that try and escape, because the vampire could be in that form. Vampire was a great shapeshifter, like the devil himself. And then, just to be sure, you take the ashes and you throw them into a fast-flowing river, so they get right away from your land, your village. So this was the most thorough method, perhaps, of destroying a vampire. Staking was certainly used, and sometimes preemptive staking if you thought this was a suspect dead person and you didn't want to have any trouble, stake them before we get any trouble when they're first buried. But other cases, when trouble starts, you stake the vampire through the head, you stake it through the heart, and these again seem to imply two key locations across history for the soul. Great debate about where the soul has been in history, but the head and heart were big locations for it. So that's your staking, and your burning could not only be thorough, but very, very time-consuming, a lot of wood, a lot of expense. Arnold Powell, famous vampire that people perhaps know from around 1727 in Serbia, and 11 corpses were burned. I think more than 11 were exhumed, but 11 were deemed to be vampiric and were burned in that case. And what else might you do? If you're going to be more low-tech, you can just burn a part of the vampire. So you might burn just the heart being, sight of life, trouble, soul, whatever it might be. And interesting case of a girl who was visited by her dead uncle as a supposed vampire, complained about this greatly enough that her relatives, villagers, got the suspect uncle out of his grave, broke open the rib cage, got up the heart on a pitchfork, set it alight, or stuffed burning coals anyway into the ventricles, got some ash to drop from the heart, and as we mentioned before, different version of this, but ate some of the vampire or drank some of the vampire. The girl was given ashes of his heart in water as a cure, and this seemed to actually work, probably because it's partly psychosomatic. And this all happened in Maratina de Sus in Romania, and people probably be pleased to hear that's in Transylvania, in early 2004, just after Stephanie Meyer had signed a Twilight contract. So the real vampires lingered on, and still linger on probably in that kind of area. If you want to get more homely still, there's a couple of more methods before we get on to the poltergeists who have a connection with the vampires. You could burn a vampire in a quite specialized sense. This was in Evia in Greece, where we visited a few moments ago for that awful case of the child passed over the body and the body vampirized. In that case, people were so terrified to actually look at the vampire that they would just make a hole in the coffin and they would pour boiling oil and vinegar through. And this was supposed to destroy the vampire, and again, heretically, to destroy the vampire's soul. No masses were said for it, no prayers were said for the person. Great heresy. These humble people, they're not priests, they're not archbishops. They could make religious policy, if you like. Still more homely, arguably, in Bulgaria, you could bottle the vampire. So we're getting much more low-tech here. You need a bottle, you need a sorcerer who's expert in these matters, probably paid for it, and the sorcerer lures the vampire, we assume the vampire's invisible, as in many cases, but lures the vampire into the bottle with a tempting dose of his favorite food, which, as you probably guess, is excrement, stoppers the bottle, puts a fragment of an icon on the bottle, and throws it into the fire. Boom, vampire bottled and destroyed. Even simpler than this, probably, and with a certain kind of homely charm. You could get a newly baked loaf of bread, put it in a cloth, in a red bag, leave it on someone else's land, crucial detail here, and ask the vampire to stay there and look after it.
Okay, so let someone else take care of it then.
It's a key rule in magical cultures. If you've got trouble, put it on someone else's land. Yeah.
That sounds like an interesting prank, if nothing else. Okay, well, leaving vampires here, and all. You mentioned that you first started studying poltergeists. It sounded like it was more scientific or cultural. Do you think there's something more to poltergeist than just legend? Do you think there's something to it, some sort of energy force or something? Or, you know, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks. I do think there's something to it. It took me a long time to believe there could be anything to it. This is the weirdest stuff I've ever read, the weirdest stuff I've ever heard. And it came about through the vampires. I was researching the real vampires, which I'll be publishing later this year. And I got used to a lot of wacky things they said about vampires. In the end, I could make sense of them. I could kind of read backwards, if you like, and decode what they were saying. But what I couldn't get my head around was that they constantly said, across 300, 400 years, the vampire behaved like a poltergeist. It beat people up at night invisibly. It threw things around. It did a dozen wacky, impossible things. And it was kind of annoying reading about this. You know, I worked everything else out. What's this? What's going on? A key to a lot of this was an extraordinary vampire outbreak on Mykonos in Greece. And it was just, let me think, 1700s. The turn of the year, so around Christmas into New Year. And fortunately, a botanist from France, Tournefort, was present during this. He's utterly bewildered. He's an Enlightenment figure, man of science, rationality, and he's very sardonic about it all. But at the same time, he can't deny that people are terrified out of their wits. I mean, they're fleeing the center of town. And they say that the vampire beats them up at night. It tears their clothes, it drinks their wine, it throws over their lamps and bangs on their roofs. And this was classic poltergeist behavior. Tournefort also says, well, this doesn't happen in our house. He's lodging with the French consul, basically, of the island. And it doesn't happen with us. So once I'd read a bit about poltergeists, I realized that it does depend on an energy force. It depends on human emotional trauma a lot of the time, and it's a way of discharging that trauma without perhaps the victim of it going mad or hysterical, whatever it might be. But in vampire cultures, it's not so much social trauma, sexual trauma, personal trauma. It's sheer terror. So you get an awful kind of snowball effect that you think there's a vampire, you have genuine nightmares, you get terrified, poltergeist stuff starts to happen, and it's possibly several people in this community that are providing the kind of energy of terror to make these things happen, allow these things to happen. But Tournefort's house, no, nobody's terrified, so it doesn't happen. Poltergeists, I found, do operate according to a law of distance, and it's quite precise. The events that happen around the body of an agent come to this. They fall off quite precisely with distance to the agent, so it can only happen so close to them, not very far away. So this is my introduction to poltergeists. I spent a lot of time reading this, and you kind of thought this is very detailed, it's very precise, the witnesses are a huge range of people, they don't have anything in common, they're not just fantasists, they're not particularly religious necessarily. What really clinched it, though, was when I started telling people what I was doing, people I'd known for a long time said to me, yeah, that's happened to me. And this is what I mean about things hiding in plain sight. When someone you've known for years says to you for the first time, that's happened to me, and they give you a lot of details, and they might tell you that they were very, very frightened, but they never told you, and they didn't tell many people. So, yeah, what is a poltergeist? To come to this question of energy forces and so forth, the very basic picture is the most bizarre events you can imagine, really, utterly bizarre, beyond anything from some science fiction, pretty much. So, from rappings, knockings, hammerings, completely unsourced, completely untraceable, very, very loud sometimes, go on for hours, can actually go on for years. Objects flying around, psychokinesis has been called. So objects from the size of a glass, a cup, up to a table, a chair, hurled around, toppled over, and so forth. Fires, very odd fires that don't behave like ordinary fires, that have been described by fire crews as very, very strange, very wacky, very counterintuitive. Deluges of water or liquid seemingly from nowhere, objects appearing from nowhere, objects disappearing into nowhere and perhaps coming back with no explanation a few hours or days later. Bodies, human bodies thrown about, levitated in some cases, and much, much more than this. this is the set of events which are very, very strange, and I don't blame people if they don't believe this to hear it first off, but once you start reading and actually listening to people, you pause for thought. Almost always, if you get the barest account, a very brief account, newspaper account from a skeptic, from someone who doesn't believe in poltergeists or ghosts, they let slip that in the household there's a boy, a girl, 8 years old to 17 years old maybe, and that they're, say, an orphan. This is if you get the barest account. So they don't understand the mechanics of poltergeists, but they tell you enough to see that the events are generated by this person, who I call the agent, and that they follow them. And again, with a brief account, you get told they flee the haunted house and the events go with them. So it's not a haunted house a lot of the time, it's a haunted person. The events follow this haunted person from house to house. They often are described as following them very clearly around a room, around the house. They don't occur if they're not there, and so on. So what I like about this is, yeah, it's very supernatural, but it's also in some ways very worldly. It has implications for biology, for the body, for what happens to somebody at puberty, for what human emotion can do, if you like, when it kind of simmers, breaks out, and overflows.
Okay, so you're saying, okay, are you saying that a poltergeist could be either a spirit or a projection of the collective unconsciousness?
I wouldn't quite call it the latter, but what I would say to make a slightly different division is, yes, it could be a spirit, a ghost, a dead person, or it could be just a physiological and psychological release mechanism, if you like, an outburst that's not really controlled, but that has a use to the person, the agent, the person who's suffering the trauma. It bursts out of them, and a fair few cases, recent cases, well-documented cases, the person says, I feel better now. Some vase shoots off the table, hits the wall, they say, oh, I feel better now. You know? So the idea that this is useful, this is cathartic, and in one or two cases the person kind of oscillates between poltergeist phenomena and actual madness, and actually being hospitalized. So, yeah, I think there's a fair chance that some cases are purely human, are purely worldly cases. One very interesting case in that respect is one that doesn't necessarily even seem to involve an agent, and this is one unearthed by a researcher called Jeff Holder, very useful book I'd recommend called Poltergeist over Scotland. And he found that in Lewis, so very north, island of Lewis, Scotland, 1938, end of January, in householder Mrs. MacLeod, old lady in her 80s, suddenly at 10:30, little chunks of peat, which were used to light the fire, started to dance about on the hearth. And then they flew around. One landed in a cup of tea. Objects started to shoot about, and she said to her granddaughter, look, quick, take the plates into the pantry. Her granddaughter, unfortunately, then opened a wooden door, which, as it proved, was probably insulating the other objects, and things hurtled chaotically for just a few minutes against the wall, vases, containers full of rice, barley, teapot, tea bags. Interestingly, there were little details, very precise details, that a toothbrush was broken very clean in half, a bar of soap was broken very cleanly in three pieces as though sliced with a knife. Weeks later, Mrs. MacLeod took up a ball of wool to do some darning, and it crumbled in her hand as though it had been struck by lightning. This wasn't quite what had happened, but the thesis for this, and I think this is pretty viable, is that there was a massive solar storm going on. There were other actual storms with lightning and so on as well. And the storm was so strong, the solar storm, which is called the Northern Lights, was not that northern. It could be seen in Sussex at this time. So it was this very powerful burst of electromagnetic energy pouring into Earth's atmosphere. And we know now that electromagnetic storms have huge effects on human bodies and on human technology. They can cause a lot of damage into, trillions of dollars if they're very bad. And essentially the house went live. It had an iron chimney, an iron fireplace. The connecting wooden door broke the insulation, and chaos. But just for a few minutes. It was very, very short to be a real poltergeist case, to be a human-centered poltergeist case, or to involve a ghost. So, Yeah, a lot of this is very physical. It's the realm of physics, astrophysics, biology, as much as the realm of the dead. But in some cases, as I can describe for you, I do think that poltergeists are actually ghosts. There's some cases where the intention, the agenda, the behavior is too directed to write it off as purely human.
Have you ever been in a haunted house?
I don't think I have. Have you?
Actually, I have to say, I once stayed in a house. Someone had left, a person. I was moving into a community, and I was allowed to temporarily stay in a little house that this person owned. And it just had there was a whole bunch of things that were just really creepy and so forth. And then later I found out there'd been a murder in that house.
Yeah.
And that was after, taking a look at my wife was cleaning the ceiling with a friend, and they found blood stains.
Wow.
And that's when I felt like, I'd never felt that in a home before when I was in there. I've been in all kinds of camping or staying at people's houses or something conditions. But there was a special vibe that was hitting. And it wasn't until after all of this that I found out there'd been a murder there.
Yeah. I mean, it's very interesting what you say because, what might sound very subjective. I didn't see anything, I didn't hear anything, but there was a presence. A few years ago, I wouldn't really have listened to this kind of story, but I can give you an example of that, which is very, very persuasive. I'll just preface it with a more famous one briefly. And this is 2014 in July. This burst into the UK press and elsewhere, I think. The cricketers, the England cricketers, people will say these people are always looking for excuses for their performance. But Stuart Broad and Matt Pryor were staying in the Langham Hilton Hotel in the middle of London and claimed that they suffered something like a haunting in the building. Now, haunted houses are not so common perhaps as haunted people, but the Langham does seem to be really haunted. There's some very persuasive, precise ghost stories from that building over the years. And Broad he felt something very powerful in the room. The taps were going on and off. It was very hot. But apart from that, there wasn't much to really put your finger on to really, objectively use as evidence. Yet he was utterly spooked. Young guy, tough sportsman. But he was so spooked, he went online. He found that Matt Pryor in another room was spooked as well. And was also online for that reason, and the two of them went and shared the room. Pryor's room had 2 beds, and they spent the night there. A lot of other people in the building at the time, wives, the cricketers, were pretty spooked. Now, this is a famous case, which I don't know I would have taken so seriously. If I hadn't heard this story, someone I know quite well was staying when he was 17 at his girlfriend's house in the countryside. And he was sleeping because he was considered a bit young in his own room. Girlfriend was in another room, quite a big house, and he woke up, bolt upright as he describes it, in bed about 2 in the morning. Couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything. Absolutely convinced there was someone in the room, almost as if you're in a pitch black room and hell, there's someone here. You can't even hear them breathing, but there's a presence. You've got an evolutionary kind of mechanism that says, look, someone's close, do something. So he was very spooked, tried to talk himself out of it. Very no-nonsense guy, rugby-playing, hard-headed guy. He finally turned the light off, tried to go back to sleep, and then he said, almost immediately, this is where I need TV, but I'll do my best. It was bang, as though someone had stuck their face right in his 3 inches away in the dark. And at this point, he jumped out of bed and ran to his girlfriend's room. Now, this might sound fairly subjective, but it was enough to make him run out to another room, and this is, sort of thing that a 17-year-old guy wants to own up to. In the morning, he got down quite late, having had a pretty rough night, as you imagine, and he said to the mother of the house about what had happened. She said, wow, that's interesting, because my daughter, I think was 6, came down an hour before you and said, Mummy, who was that man outside my window last night? So window incidentally on the first floor, and she meant literally, they checked this right outside the window, not away down on the ground. Something very interesting here about the kind of people that see ghosts, the levels of manifestation. Same ghost, same house, different levels of manifestation or visibility. And there is something about children. Children do tend to see ghosts. when a child says to you, I saw a ghost, don't pat them on the head and assume they're just making it up. There's a lot of very, very objective evidence that bears this out.
Okay, interesting there. Speaking of kids, my daughter was asking, what if you know anything about this? She was asking me to ask you about Banshees.
Yeah, I don't know a huge amount, but I did get told a story by a woman who grew up in Ireland. Now, let me describe this as best I can. This is not my area, but I believe the castle that is now used as the stage set, if you like, for Game of Thrones, so it's a ruined castle, which a lot of people are familiar with. That castle is in Ireland. I do know this. The name of it will come to me if I want to put the phone down. But it was basically supposed to be destroyed by a banshee because they upset it. It was a well-known resident banshee of the castle, spirit of some kind, loosely call it. And I think it was something to do with somebody upsetting its particular room, intruding on its particular room, whatever it was. And it burned the place down. Now, places burn down all the time, especially when they're made of a lot of wood or there's a lot of fires there. But it could have been a poltergeist. What I've come to realise is that ghosts, demons, vampires, fairies, surprisingly actually, fit very, very well. Witches to a much smaller extent, but they do enter the picture. All of these entities actually have been underlain by genuine poltergeist phenomena. So when people in the past have said seemingly crazy, crazy things about spirits, demons, bogies of various kinds, sometimes they've actually been telling the truth. And the Banshee case, given the severity of poltergeist fires, they burned down a lot of properties. It could have been a poltergeist.
So a Banshee is more of a kind of an evil type of ghost or entity.
I wouldn't swear to that. It's a very distinct thing. There's a lot of very distinct Irish folklore, and it's quite hard to be an expert on that as well as on ghosts and so forth. It's associated with death. It's said to make noises. So I think there's at least an overlap with poltergeists and with ghosts. But I think you want to talk to an expert on that to get a much more fuller picture than I can give.
Okay, well, let's see here. Is there, in our last few minutes, is there anything else you'd like to mention?
Yes, poltergeists and ghosts. Yes, I think the process of the way I came through this research is probably interesting for people who are rightly, I'd hope, very sceptical of what I'm saying, unless they've actually suffered a poltergeist themselves or seen a ghost themselves, and this is a surprising number of people. So, yeah, I found that people would tell you things they didn't tell you if they knew you were researching this. I initially tried to shut the poltergeist down to the simplest explanation, and this was that they were these purely human agents being followed around. They were traumatized. They discharged the energy in these bizarre but kind of explicable incidents of psychokinesis and so on. But as I went along, I was trying to shut ghosts out of the picture. There was enough chaos going on in my research without ghosts. But ghosts kept coming into the picture, and I got quite irritated when they came back. Eventually, I found you couldn't ignore them. And what was interesting then was that where I'd been talking to people about poltergeists, they tell me about ghosts, and I think, yeah, I'm not interested. When I started believing that actually some of these poltergeists are very intentive, I thought, okay, I'll talk about ghosts. And a tremendous number of people, every possible type of person, told me ghost stories. And I think I only got those ghost stories because people knew I took it seriously. They were embarrassed otherwise. I'll just give you one very interesting example I came across recently, and this is in the new book, A Century of Ghost Stories, due out for Halloween. This is a Dublin case, 1841, July. Respectable family, has at least one servant, and they're dogged by rappings, footsteps, basic poltergeist phenomena for quite some time. A servant girl presently sees a ghost, screams one night, and she sees it, not quite sure who it is. She sees it again. She says, it's my brother. It's my brother. It's a guy called John Fortune. He, sure enough, had died in an accident, so kind of suspect death, if you like, on the railways about 10 months before. She then is encouraged by the household because they believe in the poltergeist phenomenon, so they want it to stop. Her employers say, well, look, talk to him. What does he want? So she talks to him. Very weird, eerie scenario, if you can picture it, with everyone there, the girl talking to this brother. Nobody can hear the brother, but she's having a conversation. She can hear him. Now, can she hear him? Is she imagining it? Is it all very emotional? Well, yeah, you'd think so, except the brother wants her to pay his debts. And a lot of the time, ghosts, they're not anything like the Exorcist. They aren't full of grand apocalyptic schemes to destroy humanity. They have very, very seemingly petty, very trivial, if you like, very human kind of concerns. When they've got an agenda, they want you to take something and destroy it. They want you to dig up some buried treasure. And in this case, he just wants his debts paid around Dublin. So he lists them, he lists the places, the amounts. They go around, the woman of the house with the girl, pay the debts. They get to one shop, and at this one shop, the woman says, yeah, he owed me 8 shillings. And they say, no, he said he only owes you 2 shillings. And she said, well, okay, let me go check my books. I'll check my books and I'll find out. She goes, checks her books, and yeah, you're right. He only owed me 2 shillings. Now, this is only one example, but there's a lot of examples where facts that nobody could easily seem to know come out of these cases, and certainly in this case there's a strong sense of it starts with a poltergeist, it turns into somebody, that somebody has consciousness of a kind, they have intention, they have, if you like, an agenda. So yeah, with much process of denial, having been ambushed by poltergeists, I got ambushed by ghosts as well, and expect probably to spend a lot of time in their company for the next few years.
So what do you think you're going to be doing in the future here now that you got a new book coming out? Are you going to maybe go a little bit deeper, try to find, maybe stay some haunted houses or something?
Yeah, I'd love to. I think if I went into a haunted house or a supposedly haunted house, I'd probably want to take a dog, because they're very, very good for detecting ghosts. And if there was a child there, that would be terrific, because they seem to have this ability to see them as well. Yeah, I'd love to do that. I think it will probably happen. I do know of 1 or 2 such properties, actually. I'm publishing in a few months' time another book on the supernatural, Fairies, A Dangerous History, with a trade publisher called Reaction. So that will be exciting. It will be an affordable book for kind of mass reading. I'm publishing A Century of Ghost Stories soon, but I'll also publish, I think, and I'll obviously get agreement from people, but a number of stories I've been told, including the one I told you about, the presence and the little girl seeing the man. These are personal ghost stories that, to me, have a lot of value, because when someone looks you in the eye and you know them, this is worth something, and these stories wouldn't exist if they didn't tell you them. They're unknown to anybody but a very small circle. And a lot of very loose kind of talk gets thrown around. Oh, that's purely anecdotal. People don't really know what they're saying when they say this. What gets said in a court of law under oath is purely anecdotal, and it determines sentences, death, policy. We take seriously what people say in some circumstances, and I think we should take seriously what people say about ghosts and poltergeists. So yeah, I'd like to publish these personal narratives, tremendous range over many decades, and get those out there, stuff that haunts my memory now. So yeah, I think I'll be working for quite some time on things that don't get talked about, things on the edge. These things excite me.
Oh, I'll have to have you back on here in the future when you deal with those kinds of things.
That would be great. That would be lovely.
Hey, where can people find your books?
Okay, so online on Amazon at the moment, you've got Mummies, Cannibals, and Vampires. There's a new edition, which I'm quite pleased with. We did quite a lot of new research for it, and we made it a little bit cheaper. So that's out now in paperback. Mummies, Cannibals, and Vampires with Routledge. Book on the Soul, The Smoke of the Soul, is out with Paul Grave. That details some of the things we've been talking about the soul, life and death, these basic beliefs. What else have we got? A Century of Supernatural Stories. I self-published this because I wanted to make a book that was much cheaper. I very much like what I've done, but the Mummies, Cannibals, and Vampires you buy it new. It cost £26. And I was able to publish, for I think it was about £8, A Century of Supernatural Stories. And this is 100 stories, century. The century itself is the 19th. And you get a tremendous wealth of stories from the newspapers about vampire beliefs, fairies, ghosts, witches, magical things that until I've read them, I could never have imagined them. I could never have made them up. Things that took my breath away, and I thought I'd seen it all. So that I really like, and it's a much more affordable book of mine if people want to read these stories from the horse's mouth, in the original prose with original named witnesses and so on a lot of the time. And A Century of Ghost Stories is a follow-up to that. So I'll be self-publishing that again to make it much more affordable than it would be. And that, I hope, will be out by Halloween.
Well, that sounds really interesting. Well, we're running out of time here, but this is a really fascinating subject. I mean,
Thank you.
It doesn't have to just be Halloween. This is something that should spark someone to start thinking and considering the various realms of possibilities that exist out there.
That's great, and I hope it'll prompt, more stories. I think people have got things hidden away that I hope they'll talk about.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Richard, and I'd like to thank my audience for listening, and I hope you'll return again next week for another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions.